Tov, a gute Woche. I've been telling Baal Shem Tov stories for the last few years here on YouTube for the last 2 years, and I want to make a brief parenthesis to tell the story of the stories, basically to introduce a bit more in detail the book from which I'm telling the stories, the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov, as well as some of the controversies regarding the book and its stories, in order to give a better introduction to what it is I am doing and trying to accomplish through the telling of the stories of the Baal Shem Tov. To begin with, the Gedolei HaChasidim, the great sages of Hasidus, they give a tremendous importance to the telling of Maaseh Tzadikim, of the stories of Tzadikim, of Sipurim Tzadikim, and Sipurim, particularly of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov himself, in a story I have not yet told, story 174, he mentions that whomever tells the story of the praises, of the Shevachim of Tzadikim, Shivchei Tzadikim, is as though he dedicated himself to learning the Maaseh Merkava, the mystical secrets of Kabbalah on how to serve and connect to Hashem. The Shivchei Baal Shem Tov is not only part of this idea of telling stories of Tzadikim, and particularly of the Baal Shem Tov, is the first book, historically the first book printed to this end, to tell stories of the Tzadikim of Hasidus, starting of course with the Baal Shem Tov himself. The author of the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov is Rav Dovber ben Shmuel of the community of Linitz. We know that he was a shoichet and a bodek. He worked, I don't know, when I'm talking to my public here who understands the lingo, he was a ritual slaughterer to make meat kosher, and a bodek, meaning that he would review the animals. He was a standard inspector of the animals after the shechita, after the slaughtering, to make sure that the meat fulfilled all the requirements of Jewish law to be kosher meat. So this man, shoichet by profession, was married to the daughter of Rav Alexander Shuchat, who had worked at service of the Baal Shem Tov as a sofer for many years. He was writing the Kameos, the Kabbalistic notes. I don't know if he also did tefillin, mezuzahs, and the things that soferim usually do. He worked for the Baal Shem Tov, and many of the stories and the traditions and the anecdotes were related through him. The author also had the rabbi of his community, Rav Gedalia of Linitz, who was one of the early first generation Hasidim followers of the Baal Shem Tov, who told him many of the stories or explained and expanded many of the stories. And he was also closely connected to Rav Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi, the town of Polona, or Polnoi, in both Linitz and Polnoi, and the place of the Baal Shem Tov in the region of Podolia. This Rav Yaakov Yosef, whose story I have told already a couple of times, is the author of the Toldos Yaakov Yosef and the Ben Porat Yosef. The book, the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov, is centered, of course, on the Baal Shem Tov himself, telling his character, explaining his wonders, his miracles, and narrates his life from the time of his father, before he was born, through his birth, through his childhood and early youth, and the time where he was a tzaddik nistar, a tzaddik but unknown and not yet revealed, the story of his revelation as a tzaddik through, at the age of 36, which the Spanish version of the video, when I tell the story, has become the most viewed to this date of the videos of the stories I'm telling. And then the rest of his life, all the things that are known about the Baal Shem Tov, many of his stories and teachings, until his passing away at age 62. Throughout the book, it mentions the great level and the leadership of the Baal Shem Tov in matters of Kedusha. And when he revealed in Es Ratzon, in the time of divine will, he revealed things that were going up in heaven and how spirituality connected to the things in this world. Throughout the book, there is also stories of tzaddikim of the first and second generation of the Hasidim of the Baal Shem Tov. Mainly, to mention just the most relevant ones, Rabbi Nachman of Kasov, also the Mesricher Maggid, Rav Dover of Mesrich, and his son, Rav Avram Hamalach, Avram the angel. The stories I've already told. They already mentioned Rav Yaakov Yosef of Polnoy and his son, Yehuda Leib the Mochiach of Polnoy. The Mochiach is the one who preached or proved Torah in the city of Polnoy, Polonia. Also Rav Nachman of Horodenka and Rav Yitzchak of Dobrovich, and the son of Rav Yitzchak, Rav Yechiel Michel the Maggid of Zlotchov, all of whom I have already mentioned in the stories. Regarding the book itself, the book was compiled as a manuscript by the author throughout many years, and it was never put in print in his lifetime. The first person who printed in the year of 1814, which is probably 20 years after the manuscript was compiled, is Rabbi Yisrael Yaffe, who was a printer in the city of Kaputsk. He is a Chassid and a pupil of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Salman Yafliadi, the first Rebbe of Lubavitch. He was in charge of printing, among other things, the Siddur of the Alter Rebbe. And he had a large collection of letters that the Alter Rebbe had given him, notes and letters with instructions and teachings. So in addition to meeting the Rebbe in person and hearing from the Rebbe his teachings and his Torah and Hasidus and the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, he had directives from the Alter Rebbe. It is believed that at least from what I have been able to find out, that the printing of the book has to do with the directives of the Alter Rebbe to publicize the stories of the Baal Shem Tov. And that the Alter Rebbe even tells him about some of the stories, wasn't like this, it was like this, he, gives him directives on what he has to do regarding the printing of the book. Rabbi Yisrael Yaffe followed the Alter Rebbe to the letter of the law. He learned of the wonders and the deepness, of the greatness of the Baal Shem Tov. And even though some of the stories are not exactly in chronological order, he more or less follows, but some things are interposed here and there. He says that in the name of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that everything that he published is true and is correct and is accurate and is well explained, and he will print it as he heard from the mouth of the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe was telling him directly. And apparently the order of the first section of stories has to follow the Seder Shtalshelus, which is something I want to correct. Since I didn't tell all the stories on YouTube, I will start next week telling them in order. So he prints the book in 1814, and the same year, after the Kapust edition, a second printing is done in Berdichev, and this second printing was directed by the son of the author, Rabbi Yehuda Leib of Linitz. Next year, in 1815, 5575, the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov was printed in Ostro, western Ukraine, in Yiddish. It was reprinted next year in 1816 in Karetz, perhaps the best known of the early printings of the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov in Yiddish. There are some changes in the order of the stories there, but basically the reduction, the body of the book is the same. Now, I have one personal note on this. This is my impression, as I've been working on the stories for the past couple of years, is that the construction of the Hebrew is a little strange. It doesn't always follow the singular and plural or the male and female tense, the way Hebrew grammar should be built. But it really struck me that the person who wrote this was thinking in Yiddish. And when you think of how they spoke the Yiddish then, the language makes much more sense. So most likely they were speaking in Yiddish or wrote it in Hebrew to be read by people who thought in Yiddish and would translate it as they speak. So it makes sense that early on they would make straightforward an edition in Yiddish. Whenever you work and publish a book, and they reviewed it, they presented in a way that was most easily graspable by the people of the time. But whenever you change an original manuscript, you kind of blur out the original intention, even with the best of intentions from the publishers. And it used to be that people just copied from the earliest editions. In the year 5740, that's 1980, a manuscript was found in New York, owned by a descendant of the author, and it was brought to the Chabad Lubavitch Library in Crown Heights. And 2 years later, Rabbi Yehoshua Monshein published a facsimilar copy of this, offset of the manuscript itself, with his introduction and notes, from which a copy of this original manuscript is available today. And for the present edition I use, which uses the original Kaputz printing as the main original source, it does compare to the manuscript, as well as some of the most annotated and scholarly reviewed works on the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov done in the last few years. In Hasidic tradition, the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov is viewed from slightly different angles, with different approaches by some of the greatest of the Hasidic masters. For instance, in Degel Machne Yehuda, the Rebbe of Stettin, Admor Yehuda Tzvi of Stettin, says that when the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov was printed, the language said, or the tongue said, that all the signals and the marvels that are narrated in the book, we can do them ourselves, meaning that this Rebbe claimed that he could do them, but the awe and the love of the Baal Shem Tov is the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov. The telling of the stories has a certain special connection that is unique to the Baal Shem Tov. So it's not just about what the moftim are, what the marvels are. There's a special connection in telling these stories. Rabbi Nosson of Breslov, Natan of Breslov, in Likutei Halachos Pesach, chapter 7, Halacha 3, for those who want to go in the source, he mentions that there are many people who don't want to believe, or they joke about the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov, and they say that the stories are not true and that they should not be printed. There are also people who are completely kosher, God-fearing Jews, that don't think the book has been printed, as they are afraid of the secular Jews who mock the religious Jews in these stories of tzaddikim, or the misnagdim, who also use the story of the Baal Shem Tov to mock the Baal Shem Tov. But nothing of what they say is correct, and one should not deny the truth to those who search it. Not only those who read it, but 1,000 more like them, he says. And not a single word of Torah should be nullified. And the body of the content, most of the stories told in the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov, blessed be the memory of the tzaddik, says Rabbi Nosson, are well known and should be spread throughout the world. So he is 100% pro the story of the Baal Shem Tov, that it should be published and told, and don't listen to those who tell you not to do it. Also among the Breslevers, a bit later, Avram, the son of Rabbi Nachman of Tolchin, states that the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov is true from the beginning to the end. And he heard it from the mouth of his father, who heard it from the mouth of Rabbi Nachman of Breslev. Blessed be the memory of the tzaddik, he says, and that only a few details of some of the stories told here may not be completely accurate. So he is, again, the Breslevers seem to be 100% pro Shivchei Baal Shem Tov. The Av Beis Din of Warsaw, Rabbi Yitzchak Feigenbaum in Orpene Yitzchak, heard also from his father, who had heard from the Marim of Gur, the Gerer Hasidim, first Rabbi of Gur, said that the stories written in the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov are not accurate or not correct historically, but one must believe that the Baal Shem Tov, blessed be his memory, had the greatness to do all that is told there. And this, I believe, is quoted by the Frierdiker Rebbe, that even if the stories are not true, one should believe they were. In Shomer Emunim, the Admor, the Rebbe, Aaron of Rata, says that basically he defends 100% that the author was Yireh Shamayim, was fearful of the heaven. The people who heard it from were Kedoshim and Leonim, were holy Jews, the holymost of Jews, and the author was an honest man, and he was very close to the Baal Shem Tov, and his father-in-law was a sofer about the Baal Shem Tov, and that all the great tzaddikim of his generation agree with him, that there is like no dispute. He defends 100% the content of the book. The Rebbe of Radomsk, the Admor Rabbi Shlomo of Radomsk, says a famous quote. He says, whomever believes in all the stories of the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov as they are told, he may be too credulous, too naive to believe, too gullible. However, whomever denies the truth of the stories of the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov is an apikoris, is a heretic. In the book Maisus Umaimorim Yikarim, the stories and the precious sayings or writings of Rabbi Yeshaya Wolf Tzikarnik, the Chosid of Rabbi Yitzchak of Skvira, he mentions a story that the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Lubavitch, was once in the room of his father-in-law, and there was on the table a copy of Korban Mincha and a copy of Shivchei Baal Shem Tov. And his father-in-law, the Mitra Rebbe, comes in. He's very makpid on avoiding bitul zman, wasting time of Torah learning. And he sees that his son-in-law is standing, not learning, and calls him, "You're battle. You're wasting time." Well, there is nothing to learn except the Korban Mincha here. So the Mitra Rebbe points at the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov. And from the answer, Menachem Mendel, the Tzemach Tzedek of Lubavitch, basically praises the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov. He's completely mebatel. He's a chosid who did exactly as he was told. There is nothing against the greatness of the Baal Shem Tov, and that mentions a story that he heard. The Mitra Rebbe tells a story he heard from his father, Alter Rebbe, who heard from the messenger Maggid, that the Baal Shem Tov had the physical capabilities of seeing 400 parsas by 400 parsas, 400 Persian leagues by 400 Persian leagues, meaning an enormous amount of territory, akin to the entire size of the land of Israel, physically. And his son, the son of the Baal Shem Tov, Tzvi Hirsch, had the capability of seeing 40 parsas by 40 parsas, 1/10 of that size. And the Tzemach Tzedek tells him that I will not take their physical abilities for the spiritual abilities, meaning that the Ruchnius, they were actually able to see a lot more. The story is a little, requires interpretation, I think, subject to my possible error, that he's saying, those who deeply understand the meaning see that this book is so high, so elevated, that I cannot relate to it. And that's what I'm not taking. Not because it's not correct, but because it's way too high. In Toldos Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Rodkinson of Königsberg writes a story about also about the Tzemach Tzedek. He came to visit a relative of his that was sick, to be, Bikru Cholim, and many of the relatives were already there visiting, and they were speaking the Barim Beteilim. They were speaking everyday small talk and not doing Torah learning. So he calls their attention, and he says that we know from Chazal, from our sages, that the Shechina dwells on the head of the Choil, of the patient. Why are you not speaking words of Torah? And they say, because the words of Torah are too heavy, we don't want to burden him. He says, okay, we have here the Shivchei Baal Shem Tov. Why don't you tell him from these stories instead of the Barim Beteilim Chas v'Shalom? Why don't you speak these stories instead of mundane talk, God forbid? In other words, you can accomplish speaking Divrei Torah through telling these stories, and they will not burden the patient. The Rebbe speaks at length about Shivchei Baal Shem Tov in his letters and in Memoriam and in Sichos, and he holds that the accuracy of the stories are not meduyak, are not to the point, and he does not derive or does teachings or conclusions of the learning of Hasidus from these stories. However, he does say that the stories are accurate as they were directed by the Alter Rebbe to the publisher, and he defends the learning and this what I'm trying to accomplish through telling the stories of the Baal Shem Tov from this book, specifically in the tradition to tell them Motzei Shabbos, although we know from the Rebbe Rashab that it doesn't necessarily have to be Motzei Shabbos. You can also tell them other days, and that not necessarily have to be the Baal Shem Tov. We can tell about the other great Rebbeim and Tzaddikim. As I mentioned before, I'm using the most accurate to-date edition, trying to get the message as clear as I can. And the author, Lubavitcher Chosid from Kfar Chabad, Levi Yitzchak Holtzman, the author of the edition, meaning the editor, the one who put it together the way I have it, is very careful, try to avoid making mistakes, and I would judge mostly successful at that. However, the narrator, as when I'm telling the stories, does commit mistakes, my own, I admit, and I apologize for all those who are more knowledgeable than me that can discover the mistakes, but especially those who may be hearing the stories for the first time. It is not my intention to mislead, and I apologize for any mistakes or errors I make in telling the stories. I will conclude with a line from a letter that the Baal Shem Tov wrote to his brother-in-law, mentioned at the end of the Sefer Ben Porat Yosef of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi, but best known because it's at the beginning of the Keser Shem Tov, in which the Baal Shem Tov speaks to Mashiach. He went up to the heavenly realms and spoke to Mashiach in his palace and asked him when he's coming, and Mashiach tells him, you will know when the time for my coming is, when your teachings, the things you've learned here, spread and are revealed through the world, and the water of your well springs spreads forward everywhere. And that is what the Rebbe said already 30 years ago, when we will open our eyes and see Mashiach here. We should have already accomplished that, and it is the intention of telling these stories. Shavua Tov, Akut Tevach.